Clara Mae Whitcomb planted 312 red pepper seedlings on the shale shelf above Lick Branch on a morning when the county soil agent came out just to watch her make what he believed was a mistake. He stood at the bottom of the slope in his tan work shirt with a clipboard under one arm. The same clipboard that had carried his name on the report 4 years earlier. At the top of that report, in block letters, it said the shelf was unsuitable for commercial crop production. Fractured blue shale, shallow soil profile, excessive slope, poor moisture retention, high frost exposure. No recommended agricultural use beyond pasture cover or natural brush. Clara had read those words so many times she could hear them even when the paper was shut in the kitchen drawer. But she did not look down at the agent. She held a seedling in one hand and a short-handled planting bar in the other. She found a seam where rain had packed dark soil between 2 plates of shale, opened the hole, set the roots, pressed the soil tight, and moved to the next mark on the cord. 1 plant, then another, then another. The county agent wrote something on his clipboard. Clara kept planting. 4 seasons later, that same shelf produced the dried red pepper that sold for the highest price per pound ever recorded at the Cumberland Specialty Spice Auction. And on the morning of the weigh-in, the county agent came back without his clipboard. He asked Clara if she would walk the hill with him, not because he wanted to inspect it, because he finally wanted to understand it. My father never called that shelf worthless. He called it hard. There is a difference. Walter Whitcomb worked the lower fields with a team, a tractor, when it would start, and whatever strength was left in his back after the livestock had been fed. But the shelf above Lick Branch was different ground. It was not a field as much as a tilted stone roof with soil caught in the cracks. You did not walk it straight. You picked your way across it. My father had cut fence posts up there. He had hauled firewood from it in a few wet springs. He planted beans in the deeper pockets just to prove a point to himself. But he never tried to make the shelf carry a paying crop, because every bucket carried down that hill cost more muscle than it returned in money. In 1976, after 32 years of working the farm, he stepped wrong on a slick patch of shale and tore the last good strength out of his lower back. The doctor in town used gentle words, but the meaning was not gentle. No slopes, no lifting, no uneven ground. For my father, that was not medical advice. It was a sentence. My mother, Elsie Whitcomb, took over the farm the way some women take over a room. When nobody notices, they have been listening the whole time. She did not make a speech. She did not ask permission. She knew which field soured first after rain. She knew which hay buyer smiled too much before shaving money off the weight. She knew the creek bottom could grow corn if June was kind, and could drown it if June turned mean. She had been learning in silence for 25 years. The year after my father stopped climbing the shelf, the county land office sent out a survey team for a marginal acreage inventory. They were classifying small plots that were considered unproductive, mostly to decide which ones should be put into conservation cover. The man who came was named Paul Harlan. He was 47 years old, 12 years in county extension, careful in his measurements and sure in his voice. He climbed the shelf with a hand level, a soil probe, a camera, and the expression of a man who expected the ground to confirm what it looked like from the road. He measured the grade. He counted visible shale breaks. He dug 3 test holes and found less than a foot of soil in 2 of them. He noted wind exposure off the ridge. 3 weeks later, the report came by mail. The recommendation was simple. Do not invest commercial crop capital, maintain brush cover, or seed permanent grass. No economic return expected. My mother folded the report and placed it in the drawer with the deed, the tax receipts, and the cattle vaccination records. That is where most people would have left it. So did I. For a while. At the time, I was 22 and working in a small spice drying plant outside Somerset. It was not glamorous work. Pepper dust got into your collar and stayed there. Your hands smelled like smoke and vinegar, even after washing. But I learned more in that plant than I had learned in any classroom, because every truck that came through the door taught me what the market actually paid for, not what farmers hoped buyers wanted, not what bulletins said in careful language, what money changed hands for. The big flatland growers brought in beautiful peppers by the crate. Long pods, smooth skins, heavy weight, uniform size. They were good for volume. They dried cleanly and packed well. But they did not bring the premium. The premium went to the rougher lots from the upland pockets, the ones grown in thin soils, on poor slopes, in little family plots where the fruit came in smaller but sharper. Buyers called it character. Restaurant suppliers called it bite. Hot sauce makers called it backbone. The lab sheets called it capsaicinoid density and volatile oil concentration. The buyers did not care what name was used, as long as the pepper carried heat, smoke, and depth after drying. One older grader at the plant told me something I never forgot. Flat ground grows weight, he said. Mean ground grows fire. I thought about the shelf above Lick Branch. I thought about that fractured shale holding day heat and bleeding it back into the cold air after sunset. I thought about the soil that was too thin for corn, too broken for equipment, too steep for standard rows. And for the first time, I wondered whether the report had not been wrong exactly. Maybe it had simply been answering a question nobody should have asked. Is this good land for normal crops? No. Is it good land for the right pepper? That question was not in the report. I spent the winter of 1980 with a notebook at the kitchen table. I found an old regional pepper variety called Cumberland Long Red from a grower in Casey County who still kept seed in tobacco tins. It was not fashionable. It did not give large fruit. It was selected over generations by hill families who grew peppers, where spring nights stayed cold, soil drained fast, and plants had to survive with less comfort than catalog varieties expected. I bought a small technical bulletin from the State Agricultural College on upland pepper trials. Most people would have skipped over the parts that interested me. There were tables on minimum night temperature, near exposed stone, notes on drought stress, measurements of fruit heat under restricted moisture. The shelf matched the ugly column. That was the point. If the shale warmed during the day and released even 3 degrees after dark, it could protect blossoms from late frost. If the shallow soil forced moderate stress without killing the plant, it could make the fruit hotter. If the slope made tractor work impossible, that did not matter, because premium dried peppers were picked by hand anyway. The same features that made the shelf useless for mechanized commodity crops made it almost custom-built for a crop where flavor beat volume. I ran the numbers in 2 columns: conservative and strong, transplants, hand tools, water hauling, drying screens, burlap sacks, soil tests, thermometers, a small propane dryer upgrade if the first harvest justified it. Then I ran the income, using the premium I had seen with my own eyes at the drying plant. Even in the conservative column, the second full harvest recovered the starting cost. By the third, a single hillside acre could out-earn creek-bottom corn. When I showed the numbers to my mother, she listened for nearly an hour without touching her coffee. Then she asked, "What does Paul Harlan's report say?" I told her. The report said the shelf was unsuitable for annual commercial crops requiring normal soil depth, moisture retention, and equipment access. She looked toward the window where the ridge was black against the evening sky. Then she said, "That sounds like a report on corn." I said, "It is." She nodded once. "Then plant something that doesn't know it's supposed to be corn." I went to see Paul Harlan in May of 1981. I brought my notebook, the old report, the pepper bulletin, and a sample bag of dried Cumberland Long Red from the grower in Casey County. Paul let me talk. He was not rude. That almost made it harder. He listened the way a doctor listens to a patient explaining a cure found in a newspaper clipping. When I finished, he opened his report and tapped the soil profile section with his pencil. "Clara," he said, "all of this sounds reasonable in a trial plot. It does not change the field condition. You have fractured shale, shallow soil, difficult access, and documented frost risk. One bad April could wipe out your investment. One dry July could stunt the whole planting. If you insist on testing it, do 25 plants on the lower bench. Do not cover the whole shelf. Then he pushed my notebook gently back across the desk. I am not telling you this to discourage you. I am telling you because the land has limits. I thanked him. That afternoon, I called the grower in Casey County and ordered 312 transplants. The plants arrived in the back of my cousin Lorna's pickup in early August, packed in flats with damp newspaper over the roots. They were not impressive plants, thin stems, narrow leaves, a little wild-looking compared with catalog peppers. To me, they looked like they knew how to live without being pampered. We laid them under the porch shade and sorted them by strength. The stockiest plants would go on the upper shelf, where the shale lay closest to the surface. The smaller ones would go lower, where deeper soil gave them a better start. I had marked the hillside with a cord knotted every 20 inches. I did not plant in straight rows because the hill would not allow it. I planted by pockets. Wherever the shale opened a seam deep enough to hold roots, that was where a plant belonged. The first day was marking. The second day was opening holes. The third day, Paul Harlan drove up in the county truck. He did not come alone. He had a younger field assistant with him, a man who kept looking at the hill as if it were more interesting than Paul wanted it to be. I was kneeling between two shale plates when Paul called up to me. "Clara, how many are you putting in?" 312. He looked down at his clipboard. "That is not a test." "No," I said. "It is a planting." He climbed partway up, stopped where the slope steepened, and looked at the shallow holes I had opened. "You are going to fight moisture all season," he said. "And if we get a hard freeze after bud set, this shelf will not forgive it." I pressed soil around another seedling. Paul waited for me to answer. I did not. He said, "There is still time to move most of these to the lower field." I tied the seedling to a split reed stake. The field assistant crouched beside one of the holes and touched the shale with the back of his fingers. "It's warm," he said. Paul gave him a look. The assistant stood up. Paul wrote something on his clipboard. By the time he left, I had planted 68. By sunset, I had planted 91. By the end of the fourth day, all 312 were in the hill, and my hands were swollen so badly I had to hold my spoon with 3 fingers at supper. My mother set a bowl of soup in front of me and said, "The hill knows you came." That first year, everyone came to watch, not all at once, not loudly, but they came. A cattleman named Vernon Pike parked at the fence and told my uncle that shale did not feed roots. A flatland pepper grower named Roy Bell said, "The peppers might live, but they would never size." My cousin Martin, who had lost money on a strawberry patch 2 years earlier, said there was a reason old farmers did not gamble on ground that fought back. Paul Harlan came on his rounds every few weeks, sometimes with the assistant, sometimes alone. He measured nothing. He only looked, wrote, and left. I measured everything. I drove 3 metal stakes into the shelf, painted white at the top, so I could find them after rain. I placed minimum thermometers near each stake, and one in the creek bottom field, below every cold night. I wrote down the readings. Every 2 weeks, I measured plant height and stem thickness on 30 marked plants. Every month, I bagged soil samples and mailed them to the college lab with point codes and dates. Lorna helped me on Sundays. My mother checked the notebook for missed rows the way she checked farm accounts. The plants did not grow the way creek bottom peppers grew. They looked stubborn, not lush. On the lower shelf, they put on height and leaf. On the upper shelf, they stayed tighter, darker, slower. The leaves curled a little at midday and opened again by evening. To people driving by, that looked like failure. To me, it looked like the plant was spending less on comfort and more on survival. Then April came. The night of April 17, 1982, the temperature at the county station dropped to 29 degrees. That was the night Paul Harlan's report had warned about. The co-op growers in the lower fields had already seen new growth after 2 warm weeks, and by morning the tender tops were blackened. Roy Bell lost enough early growth to set his harvest back nearly a month. At daybreak, I walked up the shelf with a flashlight still in my hand. The shale was cold on top, but not dead cold. The thermometer at the upper stake read 34. The lower field thermometer read 28. I checked the first plant. No burn. Second plant. No burn. By the time I reached the upper shelf, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely write. County station, 29 degrees. Creek bottom field, 28 degrees. Upper shale shelf, 34 degrees. Visual damage, none. 5 degrees. That was all. 5 degrees was the difference between disaster and proof. I did not celebrate. Not then. I was too aware of how much season still stood between those plants and money. Frost had not killed them, but drought still could. Disease still could. Bad drying still could. A buyer's shrug still could. But something changed after that morning. Not outside, inside me. Before the frost, I believed the hill might be what I thought it. It was. After the frost, I knew the report had missed the thing that mattered. In July, the shelf turned brutal. Rain slid off the shale as if the hill were refusing charity. The creek bottom peppers grew taller, greener, prettier. Mine looked like they were arguing with the ground every day. Vernon Pike said they were starving. Roy Bell said no buyer paid extra for ugly plants. Martin asked me, not unkindly, whether I wanted help pulling them before I lost another month to pride. I said no, because by August, the first mature pods on the upper shelf had turned a red so deep it looked almost brown in the evening light. They were smaller than Roy Bell's peppers, no question. But when I split one open with my thumbnail, the smell came out sharp and smoky, like heat trapped in a cedar box. I dried the first sample on a screen in the wash house. When I opened the jar 3 days later, my mother looked up from the table. She smelled it from across the room. In September, the field assistant who had touched the warm shale came back without Paul. His name was Neil Mercer. He had shown my temperature records to a professor from the agricultural college, Dr. Helen Rusk, who studied specialty peppers and stress chemistry. Dr. Rusk came 2 weeks later in work boots with mud already dried on the cuffs. That made me trust her before she said a word. She did not stand at the road and make judgments. She climbed the shelf. She dug where the plants were weakest. She measured the shale temperature in full sun and again near dusk. She read my notebook under the walnut tree for nearly half an hour. Then she said, "You have better field records than half the funded trials I review." I did not know what to say. She took pepper samples from the lower shelf, middle shelf, and upper shelf. She asked if she could compare them with Creek Bottom Cumberland Long Red from another grower. 3 months later, she mailed the results. The upper shelf pods were smaller by weight, but their capsaicinoid density was 31% higher than the creek bottom control. Their dried color retention was stronger. Their volatile oil reading was higher. The official weaknesses of the shelf were becoming measurable quality advantages, not opinions. Measurements. Still, measurements do not pay bills until someone buys the crop. The second-year harvest was enough to test the market, but not enough to build a life on. I took samples to 3 buyers. The first liked the heat, but wanted volume. The second liked the color, but did not want to separate a special lot. The third, a small batch sauce maker in Lexington named Nora Vale, opened the sample bag, crushed 1 pod between her fingers, smelled it, and stopped talking. She asked where it was grown. I told her. She asked whether it was mixed with lower field pepper. I said no. She said, "Do not ever mix it." She bought the sample lot at 37% above the standard dried pepper price. Then she told me something I wrote down as soon as I got back to the truck. The story is not decoration. The story is part of the product, if the product proves the story. That sentence changed the way I thought about the shelf. Not because I wanted romance around the crop, because the buyer understood what the report had not. This was not generic pepper from bad land. It was shale-grown pepper from a slope that made it what it was. By the 3rd season, Dr. Rusk and Neil were visiting monthly. They brought better instruments than a graduate student, than paper bags with printed labels. Paul Harlan came less often. When he did, he stood longer and wrote less. The plants on the upper shelf never became pretty. They became valuable. They held tight clusters of narrow red pods, darker than the lower field fruit, with wrinkled skins and a dry fragrance that carried on hot afternoons. The yield by weight was lower than a flat acre, but the price per pound was higher enough that the shelf out-earned the corn ground when calculated by usable acre. That was the number people stopped laughing at. Farmers can argue about theories all day. They get quiet around a ledger. In October of 1983, Nora Vale came to the farm in a gray pickup with 2 empty sample tins and no patience for ceremony. She asked to walk the shelf alone. I let her. She spent most of her time on the upper rock, where the report had said the soil was too shallow for commercial use. When she came down, she did not compliment the view. She did not say it was inspiring. She sat at the kitchen table and made an offer. 3-year purchase contract, fixed minimum price, quality premium for upper shelf lots, payment within 15 days of delivery. One condition: the pepper had to be dried and sold under its own designation. Lick Branch Shale-Grown Cumberland Long Red. No mixing with creek bottom fruit. No blending into standard lots. No hiding the hill. My mother sat beside me while I read the contract. Her hands rested flat on the table. When I signed, she looked toward the window, not at me. But I saw her mouth tighten the way it did when she was holding back tears. Paul Harlan came the next morning. Someone must have told him about the contract. Or maybe he had seen Nora's truck. In a county that small, news travels faster than weather. He parked at the fence and walked to the bottom of the shelf. The plants were heavy with the last of the red pods. Burlap sacks sat in the shade. The drying screens were stacked against the wash house. The air had that pepper smell in it, dusty and sharp. Paul stood there for a long time. Then he came to where I was tying a sack. He had no clipboard. That was the first thing I noticed. He said, "Clara, would you be willing to walk me through what you did here?" I tied the knot before answering. Then I said, "After the weigh-in." He nodded. He waited under the walnut tree for nearly an hour. When we climbed the shelf, I showed him everything. The temperature stakes, the soil pockets, the upper plants, the lower comparison rows, the spots where the shale took heat, the places where water escaped too fast and forced the plant to toughen, the notebooks with the frost readings, soil samples, and harvest weights. I did not make him apologize. A man can spend an hour trying not to see a thing, or he can finally turn his whole face toward it. That day, Paul turned. In January of 1984, the Agricultural College released a regional field note on Cumberland long red production in fractured shale uplands. Dr. Helen Rusk's name was first. Neil Mercer's was second. Mine was listed as the grower, whose records supplied the field data. The field note identified the same mechanisms I had been writing down in pencil. Exposed shale increased near plant nighttime temperature by 3 to 5 degrees after sunny days. Moderate moisture stress in shallow soils increased pungency and dried color intensity. Hand-harvested specialty pepper could be economically viable on slopes unsuitable for mechanized commodity crops. The document reached the county extension office in February. Paul called before supper. He asked if he could bring me a copy. When he arrived, he had written a note on the top margin. Your records changed the question our assessment should have asked. I read the note twice. Then I said, Paul, the next time you classify a piece of hard ground, ask what crop the farmer has in mind before you decide what the ground is. He looked down at the paper. Then he said, that is fair. I said, no, it is necessary. The report from 1977 stayed in our kitchen drawer. I did not burn it. I did not frame it. I did not need it punished. The report had measured what it was built to measure. It counted soil depth. It counted slope. It counted equipment access. It counted frost risk. But it never counted the crop. It never counted the market. It never counted the woman who would haul water up shale because she had seen buyers pay for fire instead of weight. A report can be accurate and still be incomplete. That is the dangerous kind, because wrong papers are easy to dismiss. Incomplete papers sound responsible while they close a gate that should have stayed open. Vernon Pike planted 200 pepper, starts on his own shale bank the following spring. Roy Bell came by in June and asked to see my drying screens. He did not admit he had been wrong all at once. Farmers rarely do. He asked practical questions until the apology was hidden inside them. My cousin Martin helped build the new dryer shed. Later, he put peppers on the rocky strip behind his tobacco barn. Paul Harlan and Dr. Rusk published a revised county protocol in 1986 for evaluating shale and limestone slopes for specialty pepper production. It required crop intention, heat retention measurements, moisture stress classification, and hand harvest market assessment before land could be labeled commercially unsuitable. At the bottom of the first page, in a sentence drier than it deserved, the protocol credited field observations from Clara Mae Whitcomb of Lick Branch. My father never got his back. But one morning, when the peppers were shoulder high on the middle shelf, he walked as far as the lower gate with his cane. He stood there, looking up at the hill he could no longer climb. After a while, he laughed. Not loud, just once. My mother asked him what was funny. He said, all those years I thought that hill was hard because it was poor. Then he pointed with his cane toward the red plants in the shale. Turns out it was hard because it was particular. That is the truest thing anyone ever said about that ground. Today, the upper shelf above Lick Branch still produces the hottest and highest-priced pepper on the farm. The plants still look smaller than they should. The soil is still shallow. The shale is still sharp enough to cut through a glove. The slope is still too steep for a tractor and too stubborn for any machine that expects land to behave. Nothing about the hill became easier. We only learned what its difficulty was for. The old report is still in the drawer. Sometimes I take it out when a young grower comes by with a plan. That sounds strange to the people who have already decided what their land cannot do. I show them the page where the shelf was called unsuitable. Then I show them the jars of dried red pepper from the upper rock. I do not tell them to ignore experts. I tell them to make sure the expert is answering the right question. Because the clipboard can count stones. The ledger can count pounds. The lab can count heat. But only the field can answer what all of it means together. Clara Mae Whitcomb did not turn bad land into good land. That is not what happened. She found the one crop for which the bad parts were not bad. She planted through an official mistake, one seedling at a time, while the man who signed the mistake watched from the road. And 4 years later, when the sacks were weighed, and the contract was signed, and the protocol was rewritten, the hill had given its answer in the only language it had. Thin soil, blue shale, deep red fire. The paper called the shelf unfit. The shelf never agreed.